Haha. Welcome back, everybody. It's Hot Dad Reads. I'm tired. You ever have an Italian hoagie in the morning that is still sitting in your stomach by 9 o'clock at night? It's a delicious Italian hoagie, don't get me wrong, but it's still there. So, yeah, it's Thursday. So last day of reading for the week. We'll be back on Monday, of course. We're in the middle of Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. A new translation by Christine Doniger. Doniger or Donuffer? I don't know. What is this channel? What are we doing here? My idea is that basically, I'm reading books to my infant child, and while she's still too young to really be able to participate with what we're reading, she's not looking at the pictures. She's not. Well, she probably could start to now, I suppose. But I'm just trying to get the vocabulary up. So we read, The Hobbit. We read Moby Dick. We're just reading big, fun stuff. And I realized that this is fun, and I like reading. And I might as well. I have the equipment. I'll read to an audience. So what am I reading? It's that I'm looking for all the things that I meant to read or I was assigned to read back in high school, back in college, and just never did. And I think that there's a large amount of us that did the same. So this is really about that. This is about, hey, these are the books that you always wanted to read, never got the chance to read. Maybe they're somehow secretly your favorite, Pride and Prejudice is everyone's favorite. So let me read it to you. Maybe you've got homework. Oh, man, we got to read The Count of Monte Cristo. We got to read Ethan Frome. We got to read The Great Gatsby. Cool. I'll put it on the list. Message me. Hit me up on Instagram or Twitter or wherever and be like, I want to hear, whatever. As long as I'm allowed to read it online for free. We're talking about classics, talking about stuff that's in the public domain, which is most of what's in school. Then, yeah, let me do your homework for you. I'll read it, and you can play video games. You can go for a walk, do the dishes. I like doing the dishes. That's when I usually listen to podcasts myself, so that's why I'm always harping about the dishes. So, yeah, this is Hot Dad Reads. I'm a hot dad now, and I can read. So let me read to you. We are in Part 1, Book 6, Javert. Chapter 1, An Initial Rest. Monsieur Madeleine had Fantine taken to the infirmary. Taken to the infirmary he had in his own factory. He entrusted her to the care of the sisters, who put her to bed. She had developed a burning fever. She spent part of the night reading's hard, delirious and talking out loud. However, she eventually fell asleep. Towards the noon the next day, Fantine woke up, heard someone breathing very close to her bed, drew aside the curtain, and saw Monsieur Madeleine standing there, looking at something above her head. His gaze was full of pity and anguish and imploring. She followed it, and saw that it was directed at a crucifix hanging on the wall. Monsieur Madeleine was now transfigured in Fantine's eyes. To her he appeared enveloped in light. He was absorbed in some kind of prayer. She observed him for a long time without daring to interrupt. At last she said timidly, "What are you doing here?" Monsieur Madeleine had been standing there for an hour. He was waiting for Fantine to wake up. He took her hand, felt her pulse, and replied, "How are you feeling?" "Fine," she replied. "I slept. I think I'm better." "It's probably nothing." He went on, responding to the question she had originally put to him as though he had only just heard it. "I was praying to the martyr up above." And mentally he added, for this martyred woman here below. Monsieur Madeleine had spent the night and that morning making inquiries. He was now fully informed. Fantine's story was known to him in all its heartbreaking detail. He continued, "Poor mother, you've suffered a great deal. Oh, don't be sorry now. You have a dowry, the dowry of the chosen. Such is the way that men create angels. It's not their fault. They don't know how to go about it any differently. You see, the hell that is behind you now is the first form of heaven. You had to start there." He sighed deeply, and she smiled, with that sublime smile with 2 teeth missing. That same night, Javert wrote a letter. The next morning he took it himself to Montreuil-sur-Mer's post office. It was to go to Paris, and was addressed to Monsieur Chabelet, secretary to the prefect of police. As word had spread about the incident at the police station, the postmistress and a few other people who saw the letter before it went off, and who recognized Javert's handwriting from the address, thought it was his resignation he was sending in. Monsieur Madeleine lost no time in writing to the Thénardiers. Fantine owed them 120 francs. He sent them 300 francs, telling them to pay themselves out of that sum and to bring the child immediately to Montreuil-sur-Mer, where her sick mother was anxious to see her. Thénardier was dazzled by this. "I'll be damned," he said to his wife. "We're not giving up that child. This little songbird's going to turn into a milch cow. I can imagine what's happened. Some fool's taken a fancy to the mother." He sent back a very neatly drawn-up account for 500 odd francs. In this account were 2 indisputable bills amounting to over 300 francs, one from a doctor, the other from a pharmacist, who had attended and treated Éponine and Azelma through 2 long illnesses. Cosette, as we have already said, had not been ill. It was a matter of the mere substitution of names. At the bottom of the account, Thénardier wrote, "Received on account 300 francs." Monsieur Madeleine immediately sent another 300 francs and wrote, "Hurry, bring Cosette." "By heavens," said Thénardier, "we're not giving up that child." In the meantime, Fantine was getting no better. She was still in the infirmary. The sisters had at first only reluctantly accepted and nursed that woman. Those who have seen the bas-reliefs at Rheims will recall the protruding lower lips of the wise virgins at the sight of the foolish virgins. That ancient scorn of the Vestal virgins for the Ambubaïe, Syrian flute girls, is one of the most deep-rooted instincts of feminine self-regard. The sisters felt it with the added intensity of religion. But within a few days, Fantine had disarmed them. She said all kinds of meek and humble things, and the mother in her softened their hearts. One day the sisters heard her say in her feverishness, "I've been a sinner, but when I have my child beside me, it will mean that God has forgiven me. While I was leaving a bad life, I wouldn't have wanted to have my Cosette with me. I wouldn't have been able to bear her sad, staring eyes. Yet it was for her sake I was leading a bad life, and that's why God forgives me. I shall feel the good Lord's blessing when Cosette is here. I shall look on her. It will do me good to see that innocent creature. She knows nothing at all. You see, sisters, she's an angel. At that age they've not yet lost their wings." Monsieur Madeleine went to see her twice a day, and she asked him every time, "Will I be seeing my Cosette soon?" He answered, "Tomorrow, perhaps. I'm expecting her to arrive at any moment." And the mother's pale face grew radiant. "Oh," she said, "how happy I'm going to be." As we have mentioned, she was getting no better. On the contrary, her condition seemed to worsen week by week. That handful of snow between the shoulder blades on her bare skin had caused a sudden suppression of perspiration, as a result of which the illness, for which she had been sickening for many years, finally declared itself with a vengeance. At that time, people were beginning to follow Laennec's admirable lead in the study and treatment of chest ailments. The doctor sounded Fantine's chest and shook his head. Monsieur Madeleine said to the doctor, "Well, does she not have a child she wants to see?" said the doctor. "Yes." "Well, lose no time in getting the child here." Monsieur Madeleine shuddered. Fantine asked, "What did the doctor say?" Monsieur Madeleine forced a smile. "He said to get your child to come very quickly, and that will restore your health." "Oh," she responded, "he's right. But what do those Thénardiers mean by keeping my Cosette from me? Oh, she's coming. At last I see happiness almost within reach." Thénardier, however, was not giving up that child, and gave countless bogus excuses. Cosette was not quite well enough to travel in winter, and then there were some small pressing debts outstanding for which he was gathering together the bills from local creditors, etc. "I'll send someone to fetch Cosette," said Père Madeleine. "If necessary, I'll go myself." He wrote the following letter at Fantine's dictation, and got her to sign it. "Monsieur Thénardier, you are to hand Cosette over to this person. You will be paid whatever small amounts are owing. Yours respectfully, Fantine." In the meantime, a serious incident occurred, though we shape to the best of our ability the mysterious block of which our life is made. The black vein of destiny is ever reappearing. Weird chapter title. I got weird texts too, so I'm just checking these real quick. People are nice. Anyway, chapter 2, How Jean May Become Champ. Monsieur Madeleine was in his office one morning, dealing in advance, should we decide to make the journey to Montfermeil, with some urgent municipal business, when he was informed that Police Inspector Javert wished to speak to him. At the mention of his name, Monsieur Madeleine could not help forming a disagreeable impression. Javert had avoided him more than ever since the unexpected turn of events at the police station, and Monsieur Madeleine had not seen him since. "Send him in," he said. Javert entered. Monsieur Madeleine remained seated by the fire, pen in hand, his eyes on a file he was leafing through and annotating, which contained reports of offenses against highway regulations. He did not bother to acknowledge Javert. He could not help thinking of poor Fantine, and it suited him to be frosty. Javert bowed respectfully to Monsieur le Maire, who had his back turned to him. Monsieur le Maire did not look at him, and went on annotating his file. Javert took 2 or 3 steps into the study, and stood there without breaking the silence. A physiognomist who might have been familiar with Javert's character, and who might have been studying for a long time this savage in the service of civilization, this bizarre combination of the Roman, the Spartan, the monk, and the corporal, this spy who was incapable of a lie, this untarnished sleuth, a physiognomist who might have known of his secret and long-standing aversion to Monsieur Madeleine, his conflict with the mayor on the subject of Fantine, and who might have observed Javert at that moment, would have said to himself, "What has happened?" It was obvious to anyone acquainted with that scrupulous, clear, genuine, upright, austere, fierce conscience that Javert had been through some great inner cataclysm. Javert had nothing in his soul that would not also have shown on his face. He was, in the way of violent men, given to abrupt changes of feeling. His physiognomy had never been more peculiar or more unexpected. On entering, he bowed to Monsieur Madeleine with no resentment, anger, or mistrust in his gaze. He halted a few paces behind the mayor's armchair, and there he stood. In an almost chastened attitude, with the cold, naive boorishness of a man who has never been agreeable and has always been patient. Until it should please Monsieur le Maire to turn round, he waited in total silence, in total immobility, in genuine humility and tranquil resignation, calm, serious, with hat in hand, eyes downcast, and an expression that was something between that of a soldier in the presence of his officer and a criminal in the presence of his judge. All the sentiments and all the memories that might have been supposed he harbored had disappeared. There was nothing now but a mournful sadness on the face as impenetrable and simple as granite. His whole person emanated abjection and determination and some suggestion of brave defeat. At last Monsieur le Maire laid down his pen and half turned round. "Well, what is it? What have you to say, Javert?" Javert remained silent for a moment as though collecting his thoughts, then spoke up with a sort of sad solemnity that did not, however, preclude simplicity. "What I have to say, Monsieur le Maire, is that an unpardonable offense has been committed." "What offense?" "A subordinate police officer has, in the gravest manner, shown lack of respect towards a magistrate. I've come to inform you of this fact, as it is my duty to do so." "Who is this police officer?" asked Monsieur Madeleine. "It is I," said Javert. "You?" "I." "And which magistrate would have reason to complain of the officer?" "You, Monsieur le Maire." Monsieur Madeleine straightened up in his armchair. Looking stern, his eyes still lowered, Javert went on, "Monsieur le Maire, I've come to ask if you would be so good as to start proceedings to have me dismissed from the police." In his astonishment, Monsieur Madeleine opened his mouth. Javert interrupted him. "You'll say I could have handed in my resignation, but that's not adequate. Resigning is honorable. I've done wrong. I should be punished. I must be sacked." And after a pause, he added, "Monsieur le Maire, you were unjustly hard on me the other day. Be justly hard today." "But why?" exclaimed Monsieur Madeleine. What is this gibberish? What's the meaning of it? What offense have you committed against me? What have you done to me? In what way have you wronged me? You accuse yourself. You want to be replaced. Sacked, said Javert. Sacked, then. That's all very well. I don't understand. You will, Monsieur le Maire. Javert gave the deepest of sighs and resumed, still coldly and sadly. Monsieur le Maire, 6 weeks ago, after that row about that woman, I was furious, and I denounced you. Denounced me? To police headquarters in Paris. Monsieur Madeleine, who was not much more frequently given to laughter than Javert, began to laugh. As a mayor who had encroached on police authority? As an ex-convict. The mayor paled. Javert, who had not looked up, went on. I believed it. I had my suspicions for a long time. Don't ask me why. Absurdities. A resemblance. Some inquiries made at Faverolles on your behalf. Your physical strength, the incident with old Fauchelevent, your shooting skills, your leg being a little lame. I don't know, all sorts of ridiculous things. But the fact is, I took you for a certain Jean Valjean. A certain... what did you say the name was? Jean Valjean. He was a convict I saw 20 years ago when I was assistant warder of the chain gangs at Toulon. After his release, this Jean Valjean apparently robbed a bishop, then committed armed robbery on a public highway against a young Savoyard. He's been lying low for the past 8 years. No one knows how, and he was a wanted man. I had a notion. Anyway, that's what I did. It was anger that decided me. I denounced you to police headquarters. Monsieur Madeleine, who had picked up the file again a few moments earlier, spoke with an air of perfect indifference. And what was their response? That I was mad. Well, they were right. It's a good thing you admit it. I'm bound to, since the real Jean Valjean has been found. The sheet of paper Monsieur Madeleine was holding slipped from his hand. He looked up, stared intently at Javert, and said in an indescribable tone of voice, "Ah." Javert continued, "It's like this, Monsieur le Maire. It seems there was in these parts, over towards Ailly-le-Haut-Clocher, some old fellow who went by the name of Père Champmathieu. A pitiful wretch. No one took any notice of him. People like that. Who knows how they keep themselves alive? Recently, last autumn, Pierre Champmathieu was arrested for the theft of some cider apples from... well, never mind that. There was a theft, a wall scaled, branches of a tree broken. My Champmathieu was arrested. He still had the apple branch in his hand. The rascal gets put inside. So far, what we're dealing with is not much more than a minor offense, but now Providence intervenes. The gall being in a poor state of repair, the examining magistrate considers it appropriate to have Champmathieu transferred to Arras, where the Departement's central prison is. In this prison at Arras, there's an ex-convict named Brevet. Why he's being held there, I don't know. And because of his good behavior, he has been put in charge of the dormitory. Monsieur le Maire, Champmathieu no sooner turns up than Brevet exclaims, "Hey, I know that man." Okay, I'm just going to assume this word is pronounced fagot, because in the footnote it means ex-convict. He's a fagot. Look at me, man. You're Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean? Who's Jean Valjean? Champmathieu pretends to be surprised. Don't play the Cinvre, which means the innocent, says Brevet. You're Jean Valjean. You were in the prison hulks at Toulon. 20 years ago it was. We were there together. Champmathieu denies it. Of course he does. Further inquiries are made. The case is thoroughly investigated. These are the findings. Some 30 years ago, this Champmathieu was a tree pruner in various localities, Faverolles among others. Then all trace of him is lost. A long time afterwards, he's seen again in the Auvergne, then in Paris, where he is said to have been a cartwright, and to have had a daughter who is a laundress. But there's no proof of that. Now, before serving time with the chain gang for aggravated theft, what was Jean Valjean? A pruner of trees. Where? At Faverolles. Another fact. This Valjean's Christian name was Jean, and his mother's maiden name was Mathieu. What could be more reasonable than to imagine that when he left prison, he took his mother's name in order to conceal his identity and called himself Jean Mathieu? He goes to the Auvergne. The local pronunciation turns Jean into Sean. He's called Champmathieu. Our man offers no objection, and there he is, transformed into Champmathieu. It's not Champ, it's Champ. Like Champs-Élysées. What am I doing? You follow me, don't you? Inquiries are made at Faverolles. Jean Valjean's family's no longer there. It's not known where they've gone. You know, in that class of society, families are often disappearing like that. Look for them, and you'll find there's nothing left of them. People like that. If they're not dirt, they're dust. And then, seeing as it's 30 years since this whole story began, there's no one at Faverolles any more who knew Jean Valjean. Inquiries are made at Toulon. Apart from Brevet, there are only 2 convicts remaining who've seen Jean Valjean. They're Cochepaille and Chenaudieu, serving life sentences. They're hauled out of the prison hulks, and brought to Arras. They're brought face to face with the so-called Champmathieu. They don't hesitate. For them, just as for Brevet, he's Jean Valjean. The same age, he's 54, same height, same manner, in short, the same man, it's him. It was precisely at this point that I sent my denunciation to Paris Police Headquarters. I'm told I'm out of my mind, that Jean Valjean's at Arras in the hands of the judiciary. You can imagine my surprise when there I was thinking I had that same Jean Valjean here. I wrote to the examining judge. He sends for me. Champmathieu is brought before me. And, Monsieur Madeleine interposed. Javert replied with his sad and incorruptible face. Monsieur le Maire, the truth's the truth. I'm sorry, but that man is Jean Valjean. I, too, recognized him. Monsieur Madeleine said in a very low voice, You're sure? Javert began to laugh with that mournful laugh let out by deep conviction. Oh, absolutely. He remained thoughtful for a moment, absent-mindedly taking pinches of sawdust used for blotting ink from the wooden bowl on the table, and added, And indeed, now that I've seen the real Jean Valjean, I don't understand how I could have thought otherwise. I beg your pardon, Monsieur le Maire. As he addressed these grave words of entreaty to the man who 6 weeks earlier had publicly humiliated him at the police station and told him, Go, this proud man, Javert, was unwittingly full of simplicity and dignity. Monsieur Madeleine's only reply to this entreaty was to ask this abrupt question, And what does this man say? Ah, well, Monsieur le Maire, he's in serious trouble. If he is Jean Valjean, he's guilty of re-offending, climbing a wall, breaking a branch, pilfering apples. For a child is an act of mischief. For a man, it's a misdemeanor. For an ex-convict, it's a crime. Trespass and robbery, that's what we're talking about. It's no longer a minor offense. It's a matter for the court of assizes. It's no longer a few days in prison. It's penal servitude for life. And then there's the matter of the young Savoyard, who I very much hope will turn up again. Hang it. There's good reason to put up a fight, isn't there? Yes, for anyone but Jean Valjean. But Jean Valjean's a cunning one. It's there again that I recognize him. Any other man would have started to feel the heat. He'd kick up a fuss. He'd shout. The kettle sings on the fire. He wouldn't want to be Jean Valjean, etc. But this fellow appears not to understand. He says, I'm Champmathieu. That's all I've got to say. He looks bewildered. He pretends to be a simpleton. That's far better. Oh, he's a crafty rogue. But it makes no difference. The evidence is there. He's been recognized by 4 people. The old villain will be found guilty. It's been referred to the assizes at Arras. I'm going there to testify. I've been served a summons. Monsieur Madeleine had gone back to his desk, picked up his file again, and was calmly leafing through it, reading and writing by turns, like a busy man. He turned to Javert. "That's enough, Javert. All these details are, in fact, of very little interest to me. We're wasting time, and we have urgent matters to deal with. Javert, you are to go at once to the house of Madame Busapi, who sells herbs down on the corner of Rue Saint-Salve. Tell her to lodge an official complaint against the carter Pierre Chesnelong. The man's a ruffian who almost ran over this woman and her child. He must be punished. You will then go to Monsieur Charcolet, Rue Montchampagne. He's made a complaint about a gutter on the house next door that is pouring rainwater onto his premises and undermining the foundations of his house. After that, check on reported violations of police regulations in Rue Guberg, at the Window Doris's place, and in Rue de Garon Blanc at Madame Renée Lebosse's, and take down particulars. But I'm giving you a great deal of work there. Aren't you going to be away? Didn't you say you were going to Arras for that trial in a week or so?" "Sooner than that, Monsieur le Maire." "What day would that be?" "Why, I thought I told Monsieur le Maire the case was to be tried tomorrow, and that I'm taking the coach tonight." Monsieur Madeleine gave a slight start. "And how long will the case go on for?" "1 day at the most. The judgment will be delivered no later than tomorrow evening, but I shan't wait for the judgment, which is bound to be a guilty verdict. As soon as I've testified, I'll be coming back here." "Very well," said Monsieur Madeleine, and he dismissed Javert with a wave of his hand. Javert did not go away. "Excuse me, Monsieur le Maire," he said. "What is it now?" asked Monsieur Madeleine. "Monsieur le Maire, there's still one thing I must remind you of." "What's that?" "I must be relieved of my duties." Monsieur Madeleine rose. "Javert, you're a man of honor, and I respect you. You exaggerate your misconduct. Besides, this is another offense relating to me. Javert, you deserve to rise, not fall. I intend to keep you in your post." Looking at Monsieur Madeleine with that unenlightened but pure and inflexible conscience seemingly visible in the depths of his candid gaze, Javert said to him in a calm voice, "Monsieur le Maire, I cannot agree to that." "I repeat," replied Monsieur Madeleine, I'm the one affected by this. It's for me to decide." But Javert single-mindedly kept on. "As for exaggeration, I don't exaggerate at all. This is my reasoning. I suspected you unjustly. In itself, that's nothing. It's within our rights for the likes of us to be suspicious, although to suspect your betters is to overstep the mark. But with no proof, in a fit of rage, with the aim of gaining revenge, I denounced you as a convict. You, a respectable man, a mayor, a magistrate. This is serious. Very serious. I insulted the authority invested in your person. I, an agent of that authority. If one of my subordinates had done what I had done, I'd have declared him unworthy of his job and sacked him. Well then. Listen, Monsieur le Maire, one word more. I've often been harsh in my life. With others, it was just. I did the right thing. Now, if I were not harsh on myself, everything I did that was once just would become unjust. Should I spare myself more than others? No. What? I'd only be capable of disciplining others and not myself. But that would make me despicable. And those who say that skunk Javert would be right. Monsieur le Maire, I've no wish for you to treat me kindly. I found your kindness galling enough when it was extended to others. I want none of it for myself. The kindness that consists in favoring a common prostitute over a gentleman, a policeman over the mayor, the man of low estate over the man of high estate, is what I call pernicious kindness. It's kindness like that that creates disorder in society. Good Lord, it's very easy to be kind. The difficult thing is to be just. Believe me, if you'd been through what I thought you were, I certainly wouldn't have been kind to you. You can be sure of that, Monsieur le Maire. I must treat myself the same way I would treat anyone else. When I pursued criminals, when I dealt harshly with offenders, I often said to myself, if ever you stumble, if ever I catch you doing wrong, you know what's coming to you. I stumbled. I've caught myself doing wrong. Too bad. Let's get on with it. Dismissed, demoted, sacked. That's fine. I'm able-bodied. I'll work on the land. I don't mind. Monsieur le Maire, an example needs to be made for the good of the police force. I simply ask for Inspector Javert's dismissal. All this was delivered in a humble, proud, hopeless, and earnest tone of voice, which lent some sort of bizarre grandeur to this strange, honest man. I don't think that was the way that I read it, but here we are. We'll see, said Monsieur Madeleine, and he held out his hand. Javert recoiled and said grimly, Forgive me, Monsieur le Maire, but that cannot be allowed. A mayor does not offer his hand to a narc. He muttered, a narc. Yes, seeing as I've played false with the police, I've become no more than a narc. Then he bowed deeply and made for the door. Then he turned, and with his eyes still lowered, he said, Monsieur le Maire, I shall continue to serve in office until I'm replaced. He made his exit. Monsieur Madeleine was left listening thoughtfully to that firm and confident footstep receding down the corridor. That was the whole book. Now it's book 7, the Champmathieu affair. But I'm going to drink some water. I want Javert to be, impeccable in his speech, but he's getting a bit nasal, and I don't want to get too far into that. I can't remember his name. I'll look it up here real quick. The actor who played Javert on Broadway. Looking it up on Wikipedia. We've got a lot of opinions about the Broadway voices and whatnot. Now listen, he's not my favorite, but I respect Terrence Mann. He's allowed to exist. He was in the original Broadway production. But in the original Australian production, and my favorite Javert is Philip Quast. I love that guy. There's a UK tour. It wasn't until 2006 they had different ones. Wow. Neat. Philip Quast, man, that guy, he sings really well. He's got great, diction and whatnot, but just great presence. It's good. It's real good. So, there's a little bit of me that's trying to do a little bit of Philip Quast, I suppose. At least that's, in my head. I don't think that I sound like him, but it's just that kind of, nah, We've been waiting for it, but it seems that it's going to rain. And I'm hearing bits of thunder. So, if the internet dies or something, or gets really bad, we'll have to end it earlier. Delay a game due to rain, that kind of a thing. But, I've had my water. Still digesting that sandwich from 11 o'clock this morning. I had a lovely dinner, by the way. Made teriyaki steak over rice and vegetables. Really good. Just store-bought teriyaki sauce. I've made my own, which was fine, but I like the store-bought better. It's really, really good. And yet it's the sandwich that I feel rumbling in my tummy. Anyway, chapter 1. Suor Simplice? I have no idea. Not all the incidents that are to be read about here were generally known in Montreuil-sur-Mer, but the little that did come to public knowledge left such a lasting memory in that town that it would constitute a serious lacuna in this book if we did not relate them in the smallest detail. Among these details, the reader will encounter 2 or 3 improbable circumstances that we preserve out of respect for the truth. On the afternoon following Javert's visit, Monsieur Madeleine went as usual to visit Fantine. Before going in to see Fantine, he asked for Suor Simplice. The 2 nuns who ran the infirmary, Lazarists, like all sisters of charity, bore the names of Suor. Okay. There we go. I know this is the French. I know the Italian of it from the opera Suor Angelica, which was the 3rd part of the Tritico or the 2nd. I'm trying to remember. I think it's the 2nd. You got Il Tabarro, you got Suor Angelica, and then those 2 are, the first one's very grim and second one is so sad, and then you get Johnny Skiki, which is just silly and he writes the best music for the character who shows up, sings it, and leaves, and doesn't have to deal with all the hard stuff because totally wasn't having sexual relations with that person. But Suor Angelica. So this is Suor Simplice. Nice. Anyway, the 2 nuns who ran the infirmary, Lazarus, like all sisters of charity, bore the names of Suor Perpétue and Suor Simplice. Suor Perpétue was an ordinary countrywoman, a sister of charity in a rough and ready way, who had entered the service of God as others go into domestic service. She was a nun as other women are cooks. This type is not unusual. The monastic orders gladly accept this heavy peasant clay, easily molded into a Capuchin or Ursuline. These rustics are used for piety's heavy work. The transition from cowherd to Carmelite is nothing if not smooth. The one becomes the other without great exertion. The substratum of ignorance shared by the village and the cloister is ready prepared ground, immediately playing the peasant on an equal footing with the monk. A little extra fullness in the smock, and you have the habit. Suor Perpétue was a stout nun from Le Marine, near Pontoise, patois speaking, prayer reciting, grumbling, sugaring the invalids' tea according to their sanctimoniousness or their hypocrisy, chivying the sick, gruff with the dying, almost throwing God in their faces, pelting their moral agony with angry prayers, bluff, well-meaning, and ruddy-faced. Suor Simplice was the clear white of candle wax, compared with Suor Perpétue. She was the taper beside the tallow candle. Vincent de Paul has, with the divine inspiration, defined the figure of the Sister of Charity in these marvelous words, combining so much freedom with so much servitude. They shall have no convent but the homes of the sick, no cell but a rented room, no chapel but the parish church, no cloister but the streets of the town or the hospital ward, no enclosure but obedience, no grill but the fear of God, no veil but modesty. Suor Simplice was the living embodiment of this ideal. No one could have said what age Suor Simplice was. She had never been young, and she seemed destined never to grow old. She was a calm, austere, well-bred, cold person. We dare not say a woman who had never lied. She was so gentle, she seemed fragile, though actually more solid than granite. The needy she touched with lovely, slender, delicate fingers. There was, as it were, silence in her speech. She said no more than was strictly necessary, and the sound of her voice would have both favorably impressed a confessional and enchanted a drawing room. This fineness was content to wear the serge gown, finding in the feel of its roughness a continual reminder of heaven and of God. Let us stress one detail: never to have lied. Never, for whatever reason, even a disinterested reason, to have said a single thing that was not the truth, the sacred truth, was Soeur Simplici's distinctive characteristic. It was the hallmark of her virtue. She was almost famous in the order for this imperturbable truthfulness. Abbe Sicard speaks of Soeur Simplice in a letter to the deaf-mute Massieu. However sincere, frank, and honest we may be, all of us have at least the flaw of the little white lie in our candor. Not she. A little lie, a white lie, does such a thing exist? To lie is an absolute evil. It is not possible to lie a little. The liar tells an indivisible falsehood. Lying is the very face of the devil. Satan has two names. He is called Satan, and he is called falsehood. That is what she thought, and she put into practice what she thought. The result was the clear white we have mentioned, a whiteness that was bathed in its radiance, even her lips and eyes. Her smile was clear, her gaze was clear. There was not one cobweb, not a speck of dust on the clear glass of that conscience. When she joined the Order of St. Vincent de Paul, she had specially chosen to take the name of Simplice. Simplice of Sicily, as we know, is the saint who preferred to have both breasts ripped off rather than say she was born at Segesta when she was actually born at Syracuse, a lie that would have saved her. She was the appropriate patron of this soul. On entering the order, Soeur Simplice had two shortcomings that she gradually corrected. She had a sweet tooth, and she liked to receive letters. The only thing she ever read was a book of prayers set in large type in Latin. She did not understand Latin, but she understood the book. This pious woman had grown fond of Fantine, probably detecting the latent virtue in her, and she had devoted herself almost exclusively to her care. Monsieur Madeleine took Soeur Simplice aside and asked her to look after Fantine. In a peculiar tone of voice, the nun later recalled, when he left, the nun went to Fantine. Fantine awaited Monsieur Madeleine's appearance every day. These burps. Fantine awaited Monsieur Madeleine's appearance every day as one awaiting a ray of warmth and happiness. She said to the sisters, "I'm alive only when Monsieur Le Maire is here." She was very feverish that day. As soon as she saw Monsieur Madeleine, she asked him, "And Cosette?" He replied with a smile, "Soon." Monsieur Madeleine was the same as ever with Fantine. Only to Fantine's great delight, he remained an hour instead of half an hour. He kept telling everyone the sick woman should want for nothing. There was a moment, it was observed, when his face became very somber. But this was explained when it was learned that the doctor had leaned towards him and said in his ear, "She's fading fast." Then he returned to the town hall, and the clerk saw him closely studying a road map of France that hung in his study. He penciled a few figures on a piece of paper. Drinking water now. End of the chapter. Oh, yeah. In the chat, yeah, we read books here. There's a description. There's a YouTube video. There's a Patreon. So, you know, you can happily check those out. Hello, fireplace. How are you? Alrighty. Oh, hey. Yeah, we do this Monday through Thursday. We're doing about 2 hours right now because this book is very long. 9 o'clock till 11 o'clock. And yeah, we've got in the videos all the previous parts that we've read. You can also find on YouTube, youtube.com/@HotDadReads, the previous ones. And if you're interested in previous books we've read, we did War of the Worlds and Pride and Prejudice. Those are on the Patreon. But hey, thanks for joining us. Chapter 2. Maitre Scaufflaire's shrewdness. Also, I don't speak French. He went from the town hall to the edge of town to a Belgian from Flanders named Maitre Scaufflaire, gallicized as Scaufflaire, who rented out horses and offered gigs for hire. To reach Scaufflaire's place, the shortest route to take was down a quiet street in which the house of Monsieur Madeleine's parish priest was located. This parish priest was, so people said, an honorable, respected, and sensible man. When Monsieur Madeleine reached the priest's house, there was only one passerby in the street, and this person noticed the following. Having walked past the priest's house, Monsieur Madeleine stopped, stood still, then turned and retraced his steps to the door of the house, which was a modest entrance with an iron knocker. He briskly laid his hand on the knocker and lifted it. Then he stopped again and remained suspended in the act, as if thinking. And after a few seconds, instead of allowing the knocker to fall with a clatter, he quietly replaced it and continued on his way with a degree of haste he had not shown before. Monsieur Madeleine found Maitre Scaufflaire at his premises, busy mending a harness. Maitre Scaufflaire, have you a good horse? He asked. Monsieur le Maire, said the Fleming, all my horses are good. What do you mean by a good horse? I mean a horse capable of doing 50 miles in a day. By God, said the Fleming, 50 miles? Yes. Harnessed to a gig? Yes. And how much rest will it have after making the journey? It must be able to set off again the next day, if necessary. To make the return journey? Yes. By God, and it's 50 miles? Monsieur Madeleine drew from his pocket the paper on which he had penciled some figures. He showed it to the Fleming. The figures were 12.5, 15, 21. You see, he said, total 48.5. We might as well say 50. Monsieur le Maire, said the Fleming, I have just what you need. My little white horse. You may have seen it go by occasionally. It's a small beast of lower Boulonnais stock, full of metal. They tried to make a saddle horse out of it at first. Bah, it bucked. It unseated everyone. It was thought to be vicious, and no one knew what to do with it. I bought it. I put it to drawing a gig. Monsieur, that's what it wanted. It's as meek as a young girl. It goes like the wind. Ah, it's certainly not to be mounted. It has no intention of being a saddle horse. Each to his own ambition. A carriage horse, yes. A mount, no. We must assume that's what it said to itself. And it will stay the course? You're 50 miles? At a smart pace all the way, and in no less than 8 hours. But there are conditions. State them. In the first place, you're going to give it an hour's breather halfway. It's to be fed, and someone will be there while it's feeding to prevent the stable boy at the inn from stealing the oats, for I've noticed that at inns the oats are more often drunk by the stable boys than eaten by the horses. Someone will be there. In the second place, is the gig for Monsieur le Maire? Yes. Does Monsieur le Maire know how to drive? Yes. Well, Monsieur le Maire will travel alone and without baggage so as not to put too much strain on the horse. Agreed. But as Monsieur le Maire will have no one with him, he'll have to take it on himself to see that the oats aren't stolen. You have my word. I'll need 30 francs a day, with rest days also paid for, not a quarter of a sou less, and the beast's feed at Monsieur le Maire's expense. Monsieur Madeleine drew 3 Napoleons from his purse and laid them on the table. That's 2 days in advance. Fourthly, a cabriolet would be too heavy for a journey like this and tire the horse. Monsieur le Maire must agree to travel in a little tilbury I have. I agree. It's light but uncovered. I don't mind that. Has Monsieur le Maire taken into consideration that it's winter? Monsieur Madeleine did not reply. The Fleming went on. That it's very cold? Monsieur Madeleine remained silent. Maître Scaufflaire continued, that it may rain? Monsieur Madeleine raised his head and said, the tilbury and the horse are to be outside my door at 4:30 tomorrow morning. Very well, Monsieur le Maire, replied Scaufflaire. Then, scratching with his thumbnail at a stain in the wood on the table, he added in that casual manner the Flemings are so adept at combining with their shrewdness, but it's just now occurred to me Monsieur le Maire hasn't told me where he's going. Where is Monsieur le Maire going? He had been thinking of nothing else since the beginning of the conversation, but he did not know why he had not dared put this question. Has your horse got strong forelegs? said Monsieur Madeleine. Yes, Monsieur le Maire. Best hold him in a little, on the downhill. Are there many downhill stretches between here and where you are going? Don't forget to be outside my door tomorrow morning at 4:30 precisely, replied Monsieur Madeleine, and he departed. The Fleming was left completely baffled, as he himself had said some time afterwards. The Maire had gone 2 or 3 minutes when the door opened again. It was Monsieur le Maire. He still had the same impassive and preoccupied air. Monsieur Scaufflaire, he said, how much would you say the horse that you'll be hiring out to me is worth, on top of the tilbury? In front of the tilbury, Monsieur le Maire, said the Fleming with a guffaw. In front of the tilbury? That's a guffaw. If you say so, well. Does Monsieur le Maire want to buy them from me? No, but I want to indemnify you should anything happen to them. You can pay back the money on my return. How much do you think your horse and gig are worth? 500 francs, Monsieur le Maire. Here you are. It's raining really hard. Again, if we lose internet or something, my apologies. Monsieur Madeleine laid a banknote on the table, then left, and this time he did not return. Maître Scaufflaire bitterly regretted not having said 1,000 francs. As it was, the horse and tilbury together were worth only 300. The Fleming called his wife and said to her what had happened. Where the devil could Monsieur le Maire be going? They debated the matter. He's going to Paris, said the wife. I don't think so, said the husband. Monsieur Madeleine had left behind on the mantelpiece the piece of paper with the figures he had written on it. The Fleming picked it up and studied it. 12.5, 15, 21. They must be the distances between staging posts. He turned to his wife. I've worked it out. How? It's 12.5 miles from here to Hesdin, 15 from Hesdin to St. Paul, 21 from St. Paul to Arras. He's going to Arras. Meanwhile, Monsieur Madeleine had returned home. Coming back from Maître Scafflaus, he had taken the long way round, as if the priest's front door had been a temptation to him and he wanted to avoid it. He went up to his room and remained closeted there, which was in no way out of the ordinary, as he liked to go to bed early. Yet the caretaker of the factory, who was also Monsieur Madeleine's only servant, noticed that his light went out at 8:30, and she mentioned it to the cashier as he came in, adding, "Is Monsieur le Maire ill? I thought he looked a little strange." The cashier occupied a room directly below Monsieur Madeleine's room. He paid no attention to what the caretaker said, went to bed, and fell asleep. Towards midnight he suddenly woke up. In his sleep he had heard a noise above his head. He listened. It was footsteps going back and forth, as if someone were walking about in the room above him. He listened more closely and recognized Monsieur Madeleine's footstep. This struck him as odd. Usually there was no noise from Monsieur Madeleine's room until he got up in the morning. A moment later, the cashier heard something that sounded like a wardrobe being opened, then shut again. Then a piece of furniture was moved. There was a pause, and the pacing resumed. The cashier sat up in bed, fully awakened, stared, and through the window panes he saw on the wall opposite the reddish reflection of a lighted window. From the direction of the rays of light, it must have been the window of Monsieur Madeleine's room. The reflection flickered as it came from a lighted fire rather than a candle. There was no shadow cast by the frames of the window panes, which meant the window was wide open. In such cold weather, the open window was surprising. The cashier went back to sleep. An hour or two later, he woke again. The same slow and regular footstep was still pacing back and forth overhead. The reflection was still visible on the wall, but now it was pale and steady, like the reflection of a lamp or a candle. The window was still open. This is what was going on in Monsieur Madeleine's room. It's a fun place to end the chapter. Ooh, and hey, thank you for the follow. I appreciate that. We're trying to get above 50 followers so I can monetize the Twitch stream and take money from Jeff Bezos. So I appreciate that. Oh, it's 10 o'clock. Wow. So I got one more hour to go. It's probably another 15 pages on average. What's fun is that for the longest time when I did audiobooks, I could really only do 20 pages at a time. Granted, chapter lengths are different everywhere you go. But now I'm doing 30 in 2 hours, so I'm just I'm really happy with where my voice is going. Alrighty. Chapter 3, A Storm in the Mind. The reader has no doubt guessed that Monsieur Madeleine is none other than Jean Valjean. We have already gazed into the depths of that conscience. The moment has come to take another look. We do so not without emotion and trepidation. There is nothing more terrifying than a contemplation of this kind. The mind's eye can nowhere find more brilliant splendor and more tenebrous gloom than in man. It cannot set its gaze on anything more fearsome, more complicated, more mysterious and infinite. There is a spectacle greater than the sea, that is the sky. There is a spectacle greater than the sky, that is the inward soul. To create a poem about the human conscience, were it only with regard to a single man, only to the least of men, would be to amalgamate all epics in one superior and definitive epic. Conscience is a confusion of chimeras, of desires and temptations, the furnace of dreams, the retreat of thoughts that shame us. It is a pandemonium of sophisms. It is the battleground of the passions. Probe, at certain moments, the ghastly pale face of a human being immersed in thought, and look behind it. Look into that soul. Look into that obscurity. There, beneath the outward silence, are battling giants, as in Homer, tumultuous dragons and hydras and phantom hosts, as in Milton, visionary vortices, as in Dante. What a solemn thing is this infinity that every man bears within him, and against which he measures with despair the wishes of his brain and the actions of his life. One day Alighieri came to a sinister-looking door at which he hesitated. Here is another before us, on whose threshold we hesitate. Yet, let us enter. We have very little to add to what the reader already knows of the fate that befell Jean Valjean after his encounter with Petit Gervais. From that moment on, he was, as we have seen, a totally different man. What the bishop wanted to achieve in him, he fulfilled. It was more than a transformation, it was a transfiguration. He managed to disappear, sold the bishop's silver, keeping only the candlesticks as a memento, sneaked from town to town, crossed France, came to Montreuil-sur-Mer, had the idea that we have mentioned, accomplished what we have related, succeeded in making himself elusive and inaccessible, and now, having settled at Montreuil-sur-Mer, happy in the awareness that his conscience was saddened by his past, and that the first half of his life was belied by the latter half, he lived peacefully, heartened and hopeful, left with only two intentions: to conceal his name and to sanctify his life, to escape men and to return to God. These two intentions were so closely associated in his mind that they formed but one. Both were equally preoccupying and imperative, and ruled his slightest actions. In general, they worked in accord to govern the conduct of his life. They disposed him to be retiring. They made him kindly and simple. They counseled the same things. Sometimes, however, they conflicted with each other. In that case, let us remember, the man the entire population of Montreuil-sur-Mer called Monsieur Madeleine did not hesitate to sacrifice the former to the latter, his safety to his virtue. So, contrary to all caution and all prudence, he kept the bishop's candlesticks, wore mourning for him, summoned and questioned all the little Savoyards who came along, made inquiries about families at Faverolles, and saved old Fauchelevent's life, notwithstanding Javert's disquieting insinuations. As we have already observed, it seemed that, following the example of all those who have been wise, saintly, and just, he thought his first duty was not to himself. However, it must be said, nothing like this had ever arisen before. Never had the two precepts that govern the unfortunate man whose tribulations we are recounting come into such serious contention. He was vaguely but profoundly aware of this from the very first words that Javert uttered on entering his office. The moment that name, which he had buried beneath such deep layers, was so strangely mentioned, he was seized with amazement, and as though befuddled by the sinister whimsicality of his destiny, and amid his amazement he felt the tremor that precedes great upheavals. He bent like an oak at the approach of a storm, like a soldier at an oncoming assault. He sensed shadows filled with thunder and lightning gathering overhead. As he listened to Javert, his first thought was to go running off and denounce himself, to drag that Champmathieu out of prison and take his place. This was as painful and agonizing as an incision in living flesh. Then it passed, and he said to himself, "Come now, come now." He repressed this first generous instinct and recoiled before heroism. It would doubtless have been noble, after the bishop's saintly words, after so many years of repentance and abnegation, in the middle of a penance so admirably begun, if this man, even though facing so terrible a predicament, had not wavered for an instant, but had continued to walk steadily towards that yawning precipice at the bottom of which lay heaven. It would have been noble, but it did not happen like that. After all, we have to give account of what was happening in that soul, and we can only report what that was. What got the better of him at first was the instinct of self-preservation. He hastily rallied his thoughts, stifled his emotions, took heed of the presence of that great peril Javert, with the firmness of terror deferred any decision, mindlessly got on with whatever he had attended to, and resumed his calm, as a warrior picks up his shield. For the rest of the day he was in this state of tumult within, of profound tranquillity without. He did not take what might be called self-preserving measures. Everything was still confused and warring in his brain. So great was the confusion, he could distinguish no clear idea of any form, and he had nothing to say for himself except that he had just suffered a great blow. He turned up as usual to see Fantine in her sickbed, and prolonged his visit out of an instinct of kindness, telling himself this is what he must do, urging the sisters to look after her in the event that he should have to absent himself. He had a vague feeling he might be obliged to go to Arras, and without having in the least made up his mind about this trip, he told himself that since he was entirely above suspicion, there could be no harm in being present to see what happened, and he hired the tilbury from Scaphala in order to be prepared for all eventualities. He dined with a fair appetite. Back in his room, he fell to thinking. He considered the situation and found it extraordinary. So extraordinary that, prompted by some impulse of almost inexplicable anxiety, in the midst of his introspection, he rose from his chair and bolted the door. It's a lot of, some thunder and lightning. He was afraid something else might come in. He barricaded himself against any possibility. A moment later, he extinguished his light. It made him uneasy. He had the feeling that someone could see him. Someone? Who? Alas, what he wanted to shut out had already entered. What he wanted to strike blind was staring at him. His conscience. His conscience, that is to say, God. Nevertheless, at first he deluded himself. He had a sense of security and of solitude. Having bolted the door, he felt impregnable. Having blown out the candle, he felt invisible. Then he took hold of himself. He set his elbows on the table, rested his head on his hand, and began to ponder in the dark. Where do I stand? Am I not dreaming? What was I told? Is it really true that I saw Javert and he said those things to me? Who can this Champmathieu be? So he looks like me. Is that possible? When I think that yesterday I had such peace of mind and was so far from suspecting any of this, what was I doing this time yesterday? What's to be made of this incident? How will it be resolved? What am I to do? Such was the turmoil he was in. His brain had lost the power to retain its thoughts. They washed through it like waves, and he clutched his brow in both hands to arrest them. out of his tumult that undermined his willpower and his reason, and from which he tried to extract some clarity and resolution, nothing emerged but anguish. His head was boiling. He went to the window and threw it wide open. There were no stars in the sky. He came back and sat down at the table. So the first hour went by. Gradually, however, in his reflections, vague features began to take shape and gain definition, and he was able to envisage with the precision of reality not the whole situation, but some of the details. He began by recognizing that, extraordinary and momentous as this situation was, he had complete control over it. This only increased his amazement. Irrespective of the austere religious purpose his actions were intended to serve, everything he had done up until that day was nothing but a hole he had been digging in which to bury his name. What he had always feared most during his hours of introspection, during his sleepless nights, was ever to hear that name pronounced. He told himself that if he did, it would spell the end of everything for him. That the day that name resurfaced, it would cause his new life to vanish, and even, perhaps, who knows, the new soul within him. He shuddered at the very thought that this was possible. Certainly, if anyone had told him during those moments that the time would come when that name would ring in his ears, when the hideous words Jean Valjean would suddenly emerge from the darkness and loom before him, when that formidable light destined to dissipate the mystery in which he had shrouded himself would suddenly shine on him, and this name would not threaten him. This light would create only denser obscurity. This rent veil would increase the mystery. This earthquake would consolidate his edifice. This extraordinary incident would have no other result, if it was what he wanted, than to make his existence at once more transparent and more impenetrable, and out of his confrontation with the ghost of Jean Valjean, the good and worthy gentleman, Monsieur Madeleine, would emerge more honored, more at peace, and more respected than ever. If anyone had told him this, he would have shaken his head and regarded those words as insane. Well, all this was precisely what had just come to pass. This whole accumulation of impossibilities was a fact, and God had allowed these mad things to become realities. The sky is dramatic with me. This is fun. His ruminations continued to gain clarity. He came to understand his position more and more. He felt as if he had just woken from some sort of dream and had found himself sliding down a slope in the middle of the night, standing, shivering, backing away in vain on the very brink of an abyss. He distinctly perceived in the gloom a man he did not know, a stranger that destiny mistook for him and was pushing into the chasm in his place. In order for the chasm to close up again, someone had to fall in, he or that other man. He had only to let events take their course. All became clear, and he admitted this to himself, that his place in the prison hulks was empty, that whatever he did, it was still waiting for him, that robbing Petit Gervais led him back to it, that this vacant place awaited him and would keep drawing him back to it until he returned, that this was inevitable. And then he said to himself that now he had a substitute, that apparently someone by the name of Champmathieu had that misfortune, and that as far as he himself was concerned, being present in the prison hulks in the person of Champmathieu, and being present in society under the name of Monsieur Madeleine, He had nothing more to fear. He had nothing more to fear, provided he did not prevent his fellow men from sealing Champmathieu's life with the stone of infamy, which, like the stone of the sepulchre, once put in place, is never to be removed. All this was so tumultuous and so strange that there suddenly came over him that sort of indescribable impulse no man experiences more than 2 or 3 times in his life. A convulsion of the conscience, as it were, that stirs up all the heart's uncertainty. A combination of irony, joy, and despair that might be called a burst of inward laughter. He quickly relit his candle. We're still going. I just need to drink some water. Do I like hot dogs? Last year I celebrated Hot Dog Summer in place of Hot Girl Summer. But my deal is that I like very plain hot dogs. It's a bun, it's a hot dog, and on top of the hot dog I put another hot dog. Madness. Well, he said to himself, what am I afraid of? Why should I be standing like this? I'm safe now. It's all over. I had only one door still standing ajar through which my past might come bursting into my life. That door is now walled up forever. This Javert, who has been worrying me for so long, this terrible instinct that seemed to have found me out, which had indeed found me out, by God, and followed me everywhere, this dreadful hunting dog that was always pointing me, is now on a different track, nosing around elsewhere, completely thrown off the scent. Now, he's satisfied. He'll leave me alone. He has his Jean Valjean. In fact, who knows, he'll probably want to leave town. And all this has happened without me. I've had nothing to do with it. Well, now, where's the misfortune in that? On my word of honor, anyone who saw me would think some catastrophe had befallen me. After all, if there's anyone harmed by it, it's not my fault at all. Providence alone is responsible. Apparently, that's what it wants. Do I have any right to upset its arrangements? What is it I want now? Why should I start to meddle? It's none of my business. What, I'm not satisfied? What more do I want? The goal I've aspired to for so many years, what I dream of at night, the object of my prayers to heaven, security, is now within my reach. It's God's will. I can do nothing against the will of God. And why is it God's will? So that I may continue what I've begun, that I may do good, that I may one day be a great and inspiring example, that it may be said there was at last a little happiness attached to the penance I've endured and the virtue I've returned to. I really don't understand why I was afraid a little while ago to call on that good priest and tell him everything as I would to a confessor, and ask his advice. That's obviously what he would have told me. It's settled. We'll leave well alone and not interfere with the ways of the good Lord. So he talked to himself in the depths of his own conscience, looking into what might be called his own abyss. He rose from his chair and began to pace the room. Now then, he said, let's not think about it any more. The decision's made. But he felt no joy. On the contrary, the mind is no more to be prevented from returning to an idea than the sea from returning to the shore. For the sailor, this is called the tide. For the guilty man, it is called remorse. God stirs the soul as he causes the ocean to swell. After a few moments, he could not help but resume the grim dialogue in which it was he spoke and he who listened, saying what he wanted to leave unsaid, and listening to what he did not want to hear, yielding to that mysterious power that said to him, "Think," as it had said to another condemned man 2,000 years earlier, "Onward." Before going any further, and so as to be fully understood, let us make one observation that needs underlining. It is certain that people talk to themselves. There is no being capable of thought who has no experience of this. It might even be said that the word is a mystery never more magnificent than what it passes inwardly from a man's mind to his conscience and returns from his conscience to his mind. It is in this sense only that the words often employed in this chapter, "he said," "he exclaimed," are to be understood. We tell ourselves, talk to ourselves, exclaim to ourselves, while the outward silence remains unbroken. There is a great hubbub. Everything inside us talks except our mouths. The realities of the soul, though not visible and not palpable, are nonetheless realities. So he asked himself where he stood. He questioned himself about that decision made. He admitted to himself that everything he had just settled in his mind was monstrous, that leaving well alone and not interfering with the ways of the good Lord was simply horrible. To allow this mistake to be made by fate and by men, not to prevent it, to be a party to it through his silence, to do nothing, in short, was to do everything. It was the ultimate hypocritical infamy. It was a vile, cowardly, sly, abject, hideous crime. For the first time in 8 years, this poor man had just experienced the bitter taste of a wicked deed. He spat it out in disgust. He continued to question himself. He sternly asked himself what he had meant by this. "I have reached my goal?" He told himself that his life indeed had a goal, but what goal? To conceal his name? To deceive the police? Was it for so petty a thing he had done all that he had done? Did he not have another goal, the one true noble goal, to save not his physical being but his soul? To become once more honest and good, to be righteous. Was it not that, above all, that alone he had always wanted and the dear bishop had demanded of him? Shut the door on his past? But, dear God, he wasn't shutting it. He was reopening it by doing something despicable. He was becoming a thief again, and the most abominable of thieves. He was robbing another man of his existence, his life, his peace, his place in the sun. He was becoming an assassin. He was killing a poor wretch, morally killing him. He was inflicting on him that frightful living death, that death beneath the open skies which is called a penal servitude. On the contrary, to give himself up to save that man, the victim of such a dire misapprehension, to resume his own name out of a sense of duty to become the convict Jean Valjean again. That was truly to achieve his resurrection, and to seal off forever the hell he had left behind. Apparently to fall back into it was actually to escape it. His whole life was pointless. His whole penance wasted. And there was nothing else to say but, what's the good of it? He felt that the bishop was there, that the bishop was all the more present for being dead, that the bishop was gazing steadily at him, that from now on, Mère Madeleine, with all his virtues, would be abhorrent to him, and the convict Jean Valjean would be pure and admirable in his sight. That men saw his mask, but the bishop saw his face. That men saw his life, but the bishop saw his conscience. So he must go to Arras, rescue the false Jean Valjean, and denounce the real one. Alas, that was the greatest of sacrifices, the most poignant of victories, the last step to be taken. But it must be done. A grievous fate, he would acquire saintliness in the eyes of God only if he regained infamy in the eyes of men. Well, he said, let's take this course. Let's do our duty. Let's save this man. He uttered these words aloud without noticing that he was actually voicing them. He took his books, checked them, and put them in order. He threw on the fire a bundle of credit notes for moneys owed to him by some small shopkeepers in financial difficulties. He wrote a letter which he sealed, and had there been anyone in his room at the time, that individual might have read on the envelope, to Monsieur Lafitte, banker, Rue d'Artois, Paris. He drew from a writing desk a wallet containing several banknotes and the passport he had used that same year to vote in the elections. Anyone who had seen him while he was doing these various things that involved such serious contemplation, would have had no suspicion of what was going on inside him. Only occasionally his lips moved. At other times he looked up and stared at some point or other on the wall, as if there were in precisely that place something he wished to elucidate or query. When the letter to Monsieur Lafitte was completed, he put it in his pocket together with the wallet, and began pacing again. There was no deviation in his thinking. He continued to see his duty clearly written in luminous characters that blazed before his eyes wherever he directed his gaze. Go, give your name, denounce yourself. Similarly, he saw, as if they moved before him in visible form, the two notions that had till now been the twofold rule of his life: to hide his name, to sanctify his soul. For the first time they appeared absolutely distinct to him, and he saw the difference between them. He recognized that one of these notions was inevitably good, while the other could turn bad. That one was self-sacrifice and the other individualism. That one said my neighbor and the other said myself. That one originated from light and the other from darkness. They fought against each other. He saw them fight, as he continued to ponder that they had grown bigger in his mind's eye. They were now of colossal stature, and it seemed to him that he could see within himself, in that infinity we mentioned earlier, among shadows and glimmerings of light, a goddess and a giant in combat. He was filled with terror, but it looked to him as if the good intention was triumphing. He felt he had come to the next decisive moment for his conscience and his destiny, that the bishop had marked the first phase of his new life, and that Champmathieu marked the second, after the great crisis, the great test. But the fever that had subsided for a while gradually returned. 1,000 thoughts ran through his mind, but they continued to strengthen him in his resolve. At one moment he said to himself, perhaps he was actually overreacting. After all, this Champmathieu was no saint. He had actually stolen. He responded inwardly, very well. If this man has stolen a few apples, that's a month in prison. There's a great difference between that and the chain gang. And even then, who knows? Did he steal? Has it been proven? The name of Jean Valjean damns him and seems to make proof dispensable. Don't crown prosecutors always behave like that? He's believed to be a thief because he's known to be a convict. A moment later, the idea struck him that when he denounced himself, the heroism of his deed and his honest life for the last 7 years, and what he had done for that area, might perhaps be taken into consideration, and he would be pardoned. But this notion faded very quickly, and he smiled bitterly, reflecting that the theft of 40 sous from Petit Gervais made him guilty of re-offending, that this incident would surely be raised again, and under the terms laid down by the law, would make him liable to penal servitude for life. He turned his back on any illusion, detached himself more and more from this world, and sought consolation and strength elsewhere. He told himself he must do his duty, that maybe he would be no worse off after doing his duty than after shirking it, that if he didn't interfere, if he stayed in Montreuil-sur-Mer, his prestige, his good name, his good works, the respect and veneration in which he was held, his charity, his wealth, his popularity, his virtue, would be dependent on a crime. And how could his pleasure in all these blessed things not be tainted by their association with this hideous thing? Whereas if he made his sacrifice, it would bring to the prison hulks, to the pillory post, to the iron collar, to the green cap, to the unceasing toil and the pitiless shame, a touch of the sublime. Finally, he told himself it could not be helped. Such was his destiny. He had no authority to upset the arrangements made on high, that in any case there was a choice to be made, outward virtue and inward loathing, or inward saintliness and outward ignominy. Though his courage did not falter, brooding over such dismal thoughts tired him. In spite of himself, he began to think of other things, unimportant things. The veins in his temples throbbed violently. He went on pacing to and fro. Midnight struck, first at the parish church, then at the town hall. He counted the 12 strokes of the 2 clocks and compared the sounds of the 2 bells. He was reminded that a few days previously he had seen an old clock for sale at a scrap merchant's, on which was written the name Antoine Albin de Romainville. He felt cold. He lit a small fire. It did not occur to him to close the window. In the meantime, he had relapsed into his stupor. He had to make quite an effort to remember what he had been thinking about before midnight struck. Finally, it came back to him. "Ah, yes," he said to himself. "I have made up my mind to denounce myself." And then, all at once, he thought of Fantine. "Wait," said he. "What about that poor woman?" Now a new feverishness erupted. Fantine, suddenly coming to mind, was like an unexpected ray of light. It seemed to him that everything around him looked different. He exclaimed, "But I've only considered myself till now. Whether I should remain silent or denounce myself, hide myself or save my soul, be a contemptible and respected magistrate or a vile and venerable convict. It's just me, all the time. But, good God, either way, it's egotism. Different forms of egotism, but egotism all the same. Suppose I gave some thought to others. The supreme godliness is to think of others. Now let's consider the matter. If I'm removed, excluded, forgotten, what will happen as a result? Suppose I denounce myself. I'm arrested. This Champmathieu is released. I'm sent back to the prison hulks. That's fine. And what then? What happens here? Ah, here we have a community, a town, factories and industry, workers, men and women, aged grandfathers, children, poor folk. I've created all this. I sustain all this. Wherever there's a smoking chimney, it is I who have put the log on the fire and the meat in the pot. I've created wealth, commerce, credit. Before me there was nothing. I've improved. revitalized, regenerated, invigorated, stimulated, enriched the whole countryside. With me gone, the moving spirits gone. Remove myself and everything dies. And this woman who suffered so much, whose merits in her downfall are so great, and I the unwitting cause of all her misery, and the child I meant to go and fetch, and as I promised her mother. Don't I owe this woman something too, in reparation for the harm I've done her? If I disappear, what will happen? The mother dies. The child's left to fend for itself. That's what happens if I denounce myself. Stomach is angry. What if I don't denounce myself? Well, suppose I don't. Oh no, hiccups. We're in trouble. Oh, there's so much more. Okay. We have hiccups. We're just going to take a little break. This might actually be a good place to stop. Oh, hey. Thank you so much for the follow. I really appreciate that. As I keep telling everyone, we're trying to get over 50 followers. Then we can make steps to monetize the stream. Pardon me. And take money from Jeff Bezos. And anyone who's watching this now, this now or later, if you want to support the stream monetarily, I think it's over here. Patreon.com/HotDadReads. Check it out. And get access to all kinds of fun. I've got hiccups and I've got 6 more pages to read, so I think we are going to stop for tonight. There's only 18 minutes left anyway. Thank you all for watching. I appreciate you all. You're really cool. I'm going to go and deal with these hiccups. Have yourselves an agreeable evening.